The crisis in the Balkans actually began before Clinton took office, right?
That's right. And the situation became a political issue in the United States as President George H.W. Bush had resisted pressure to involve the United States in the Balkans. His Secretary of State famously declaring that the U.S. had no dog in this fight. As a candidate for president, Bill Clinton had promised a more activist approach. Once in office, however, Clinton dithered. Only in late August 1995 did he pull the trigger, finally prompted to act by a Serb massacre of nearly 8,000 Bosnian men and boys at a place called Srebrenica.
How did the operation unfold?
As a combined air-ground offensive. In the air phase, a U.S.-led NATO bombing campaign targeted Bosnian Serb forces besieging Bosnia-Herzegovina. This was Operation Deliberate Force, lasting about 2 weeks and involving some 400 aircraft that struck over 300 targets. The ground part of the offensive saw Croat and Bosnian forces, advised by retired U.S. generals, dealing the Bosnian Serbs a major defeat and then sending some 150,000 ethnic Serbs packing.
So the response to ethnic cleansing was ethnic cleansing?
You got it. Ethnic cleansing facilitated by the United States, as a matter of fact. As one U.S. official put it at the time, the Croats were serving as Washington's junkyard dogs, employed in effect to chase away unwanted Serbs.
What happened next?
Well, the U.S. summoned the leaders of Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina to a U.S. Air Force base in Ohio for so-called peace talks. The resulting Dayton Accords ended the Bosnia War. An occupation force of 50,000 NATO troops, including a large contingent of Americans, arrived to keep that peace. In this case, peace was a euphemism for Serbian defeat. Milosevic's hopes of creating a greater Serbia had been dashed. Meanwhile, Bosnia-Herzegovina survived as a multi-ethnic republic in which Muslims made up a clear plurality of the overall population. Within certain circles of advanced thinkers, where nationalism as such had acquired a sort of retrograde reputation, this represented a triumph of sorts, apparently demonstrating the feasibility of coexistence among Western Christians, Orthodox Christians, and Muslims.
You said there were 2 interventions in the Balkans. What was the other one?
Kosovo, 5 years later in 1999.
Remind me what that was about.
Well, once again, Muslims were at the center of the dispute, and once again, the United States and its allies went to war ostensibly on their behalf.
How did the Kosovo War begin?
A complicated story. Here's the short version. Historically, for Serbs, Kosovo represented something akin to what Gettysburg represents for Americans. It's ground made holy by the sacrifice of forebears. Now imagine that after 1865, large numbers of unreconstructed Confederates had moved to Gettysburg, converting it into an enclave of the Old South in the heart of Pennsylvania. Imagine further that after allowing these Southern transplants to replicate the so-called Southern way of life, officials in Harrisburg, the state capital, suddenly reversed course. Suppose, for example, they mandated the use of Yankee textbooks instead of hand-me-downs from Mississippi. Imagine that they prohibited the playing of Dixie on public occasions. Imagine that they declared Robert E. Lee a traitor, which he was, by the way. The result would likely be very considerable friction between members of a minority accustomed to running their own affairs and distant authorities now intent on enforcing compliance with the norms preferred by the majority.
You've lost me.
Well, this is what happened in Kosovo after Tito died, the Cold War ended, and Yugoslavia came apart. As a Muslim-majority region within Serbia, Kosovo had enjoyed considerable autonomy under Tito. Milosevic's version of Serb nationalism allowed little room for that autonomy. When he revoked it, the Kosovars, or Kosovo Albanians as they were commonly called, resisted and began agitating for outright independence. If Slovenes and Croats and Bosniaks could have their own country, why shouldn't there be a Republic of Gettysburg, of Kosovo? At any rate, a Kosovo Liberation Army emerged to take up the fight. This KLA attacked Serb authorities and members of the Serbian minority living in Kosovo. To sustain what was, depending on your point of view, either a grand patriotic endeavor or a vicious campaign of terror, the KLA trafficked in arms, illegal drugs, and perhaps even organs.
They don't sound like very savory characters.
No, but their antics provided Milosevic with an excuse to do what he probably wanted to do anyway, to purge Muslims from Kosovo altogether, so that this sacred piece of ground would once again be purely Serbian. By 1998, when something approximating full-fledged civil war was enveloping Kosovo, the question facing the United States was this one: which ethnic cleansing campaign should it support? The one by Milosevic or the one by the KLA?
What did the United States decide?
We threw in with the Kosovars. This despite the fact that U.S. officials had publicly described the KLA as a terrorist organization.
One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
So they say. At any rate, Madeleine Albright, now Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, had Milosevic in her gun sights. Albright declared, "We are not going to stand by and watch the Serbian authorities do in Kosovo what they can no longer get away with doing in Bosnia." As a pretext for war, Albright concocted a fraudulent peace process, which was intended to fail, and did.
War followed?
Eventually, China and Russia complicated things. They refused to give the war a UN Security Council imprimatur. Bill Clinton's lawyers came to the rescue, discovering that NATO itself, acting on behalf of the greater good, could authorize itself to go out of area and initiate a war.
What happened then?
Albright got her war.